I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Meghan Grebner, and thank you for tuning in to NUE Goals for NUE Ag, a content partnership with Verdesian on Brownfield. Today, we're joined by Mike Zwingman, row crop agronomist for Verdesian, for our conversation about nitrogen management. Happy spring to you, Mike.
I mean, spring's finally here, Megan. I've been waiting for it seems like 3 winters worth for it to get here.
I mean, I would also hope that you would have been hoping maybe doing some rain dances for some April, May showers, and that's not necessarily the case where you are.
I did. I've done everything. Washed my pickup, left my motorcycle out overnight, like everything that would bring a rain. Finally rained on my motorcycle the other night. So I was like, yep, we're here. But it's finally good to see things greening up and some corn poking its head out of the ground and, not having to wear a sweatshirt every day, all day long. It's been one of these years I'll quit saying this. It's been a weird spring.
I think weird spring is the new normal. Maybe.
It's proof that no 2 years are so close to identical that you can really gauge what to do. And I think, it really reinforces some concepts that you talk to farmers about that are really about looking at conditions for what they are and taking your best and making the best shot in windows of time. And, here in Nebraska, we were cold. We had some growers kind of poking around in late April, and then we saw that cold snap. And everybody kind of slowed down. I remember telling another agronomist friend of mine, I'm like, after the 1st of May, everybody's going to lose their patience and things are going to crack off. And sure enough, 10 days ago, we've probably cracked most of this corn crop and bean crop in the matter of 10 or 13 days, right? It's amazing how fast the whole industry can move when it's time. And we've had some decent weather, planting conditions, even though it's been dry. I think from a seed bed condition, it's probably as good as we've had in a couple of years. Yes, it's dry, but we've been able to manage through those things. And planters been rolling, guys have been covering acres. And now it's just about getting rain, some heat, and getting this crop out of the ground and see what we end up with.
I feel like heat's not going to be a problem for most growers, especially in your part of the world and where I am. It's that rain factor and that precip that is what is kind of nagging at everybody.
It definitely is, right? It's been hard we've had a lot of what looks like promising rain turn into 30, 40, 50 hundredths, no big soakers, and it's been, like I said, it's been kind of crazy. We went from highs in the 40s to turning around a week later to highs in the upper. I was at a track meet for my daughter last Friday night, and it was still hot at 7:00. I mean, and that's not normal, right? We went from one extreme to the other, and it's really I think it's going to prove that good management through these situations is really kind of the leveling of the playing field, right? Farmers that make good decisions and do all the things right in all the years are the ones who are gonna weather this storm or lack of storms, so to speak, better than anybody else.
What a perfect setup to talk about management, because we're going to talk about different forms of management today, specifically focusing on that nitrogen component. And this is probably the easiest way I can start you off as we get into this conversation. How and why is nitrogen so important, or is important to a farmer's overall strategy when it comes to a crop and productivity?
Probably next to water, right? Nitrogen's the most important thing. Water and sunlight. Nitrogen's the most important thing to a corn crop. in general, it's the most important thing to every crop we raise, but specifically when we talk about corn, it's so critical in that from proteins to amino acids to the big thing is chlorophyll, right? Like the driving the engine of the plant. It's the largest use nutrient for a reason. I'll make an argument there's one a little bit down the way that's probably, we want to talk about more critical. There's probably one a little bit farther down that's more critical, but nitrogen's the one that if we're short of, we can't do anything else. Like it's the connecting link of all the other nutrients, 16 other nutrients we need. If we don't have it, like it's really hard for us to get from point A to point B.
So let's talk a little bit about nitrogen management, and we talk about it in terms of its necessity, but there's also other nutrients that might get a little bit more attention sometimes, maybe like phosphorus. So do we lose a focus there because we're maybe thinking about some other things when it comes to nitrogen? And how do we make sure we're not forgetting that element as well?
I think so. I don't know if I think we go through this cyclical like roller coaster ride of nutrient focus, right? Depending on what time of year it is and what operation we're in, kind of will dictate kind of what nutrient we're focusing on. So like if we go fall and we're in those fall fertilizer applications, we talk a lot about phosphorus. We talk a lot about all these things. And once again, the good managers have the right system in place to manage all those nutrients kind of like independently. The weird thing, you manage them independently of each other, but in connection with each other all at the same time. So I don't know if we lose focus on it. I think sometimes when we get from an agronomic standpoint, I will say from a conversation about the environment and water quality, we kind of go back and forth between those two, right? And I will say it greatly depends on what part of the world you live in. So if you live in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, like phosphorus is the deal, right? Like because of the watershed issues. If you live in the Delmarva and you farm out in Maryland or Virginia, phosphorus is a big deal. North Carolina, the Southeast. You get to the Midwest, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, nitrates in the groundwater is a big deal. So I think the other thing is there's this regional focus on nutrients where we put more environmental pressure on one than the other, but agronomically, they never are out of balance.
Mike, when we talk about the use of nutrients and making sure that they're being used properly, I don't think we can have that conversation with also not having a conversation about stabilizers. Talk to me about nitrogen stabilizers and the positives and the benefits that farmers see from utilizing them.
So, nitrogen stabilizers help us buffer the unpredictability of the nitrogen cycle, right? Like, theoretically, as dry as it is, we shouldn't have a whole lot of potential for nitrate leaching, or I should say, we shouldn't have a lot of potential for nitrification or denitrification just because it's so dry. But our volatilization risk of like the urea that's laying on top of the soil is pretty high because of that. We have a lot of organic matter on top of the soil. It's going to get moist with morning dew, and we're heating up pretty fast. So that's a pretty big condition for volatilization. Now, if we were to start getting rain, now nitrification becomes an issue. And if we look at how dry it is in our soil profile, there's a difference between leaching nitrogen and becoming a groundwater problem versus leaching nitrogen and becoming an agronomic problem. Like we only have to move nitrogen just a little bit farther than where the roots are, and all of a sudden it's unavailable to the plant. So if we had some nitrification, we start getting some big rains that are soakers, and it pushes a lot of water through the soil profile. and that nitrate goes with it. Now that nitrate's below the soil surface or below the root mass, and it's really going to be hard for us to take that up. So nitrogen stabilizers are going to help us keep that ammonium attached to the soil particle and keep it up in the root mass, and keep it available for that plant longer. That's what a stabilizer does. It buffers that time and unpredictability of what's going to happen in the growing season. And I really, I'm really kind of, one of the things that we need to talk about in nitrogen management as a whole this year is we have to be honest with the drought conditions we have going into the season about evaluating these crop stands when they come out of the ground, and then taking that evaluation of the stands, how consistent they are, how vigorous they are, all these things, and does that impact yield potential? And if we're in a split nitrogen program, we can make that adjustment now, and then that nitrogen stabilizer is going to help us capitalize on whatever that adjustment is. Because this is where, nitrogen's still expensive, right? So this is where we need to make sure we're matching sink yield with source nitrogen application and balancing those things out. And yes, that maybe if you back off your nitrogen, it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's why you have to be completely rigorous and honest with yourself about what your yield potential is and what risk you're willing to go either way. And this is my pitch for your local agronomist. That's something a model can't tell you. That's where a model can help you get there, but evaluating your risk and your comfort with where you want to go is where you need your local agronomist. And then, like I said, taking other tools like nitrogen stabilizers and layering it on them is going to be what helps us make sure we're most profitable through what's setting up to be a fairly challenging growing season for a lot of growers.
Do we also have to maybe focus on production cost and thinking about it as a cost per bushel or cost versus a cost per acre to produce, to know, just seeing what's going on commodity price wise? Right. We've seen prices back off some, to know that to get the most out of the crop that we can, to know where to spend and where it's not worth it to make cuts also.
Yeah. So once again, that's why models are great for what models are great for, but they're only one piece of the equation, right? Then it comes into where your financial position is and what you need to do to make money, and then what your risk tolerance is on how aggressive you want to go either way, right? I could make an argument for some, if I look back at 2012, I can make an argument that by Memorial Day of 2012, I could have told a lot of growers we shouldn't put on any more nitrogen because it just wasn't going to be worth it. Now, if the downside to that is if it starts raining and I'm wrong, right? So you have to find that middle ground. A good friend of mine says nitrogen management's all fun and games until the corn turns yellow, right? And then all of a sudden you realize you messed up. And so you have to, there's an art form to nitrogen management where you know your soils, your farms better than anybody else. And so go do when we get 30 days out from corn coming out of the ground, go do some real hard work on what your yield potential is. Look at your production costs, look where you need to be, and make the best decision possible. Then, like I said, right, use all the tools in the toolbox. You've heard me say this before, one tool is a tool, but when you put them all together, it's a system. And if we build the right system, we can be resilient through this year. And like I said, nitrogen stabilizers are, to me, a critical part of helping us balance that uncertainty.
I feel like they also play a pretty critical role in that whole sustainability conversation as well, which is what we hear a lot about, whether it's talking about a more focus on a sustainable agriculture, sustainable production. How does a nitrogen stabilizer fit into that conversation?
So what it does is, if we can make sure the nitrogen we apply is always available, that gets into the plant, what we do is we can't control the nitrogen that comes from the soil, right? Like, we can't control what the fate of the nitrogen comes from mineralization is. Some of that will go to the plant. Some of that will go back into the nitrogen system. Some of that might get leached. Some of it might just exit, right? But what we need to make sure we're doing is always make sure we're removing way more nitrogen than we're applying. And if we can get nitrogen rates to look like 0.7 pounds per bushel, what that does, that means we're removing 30% more nitrogen in that system than we're applying. And the rest of it's kind of in balance. And I'm going to say this till I'm blue in the face. The most sustainable nitrogen program for growers, from both an agronomic, or from all these things, agronomic, economic, and environmental standpoint, is always be using the optimal rate of nitrogen. That doesn't necessarily, now, does that mean there's some rooms for some growers to make some trims? Yes. But we have to be smart about those. And that razor's edge is a dangerous place to be, but it's where we want to go. And so we need to, as we talk about these things and look at nitrogen rates, it's always about how can we take that, I'm going to go back to nitrogen stabilizers, take that uncertainty out of the nitrogen rec. So waiting till we have a pretty good idea what our yield potential is, right? And making those decisions as late as we can to get to that optimum rate. If we can do that, now we're removing way more nitrogen than we're applying. And that, at the end of the day, that's good for the environment. It also continues to feed the nitrogen, the carbon to nitrogen balance in the soil that improves soil health, right? So if we started cutting nitrogen rates without really any concern about what it'd do, for a while, the soil would be able to buffer that. But then as the downside to getting free nitrogen from the soil and not providing any nitrogen back into the system is we start burning carbon to do it. And then the less carbon we have, the less capacity to make nitrogen we have. And all of a sudden our yield level starts to drop off because we're burning the fuel tank. So the best thing to do is keep that total dissolved nitrogen, total dissolved carbon in the soil pretty well balanced in that ratio. And that's what's best for soil health. So then as soil carbon goes up, so dissolved nitrogen go up, but that's because there's more organisms in the soil to support that carbon.
All of these are great tools, and putting together a system in place, right, is great. But education, I think, is a component of that as well. So for farmers and retailers who want to learn more about effective nitrogen management, how to put that proper system together, what's the best way for them to do that?
I'm convinced the grower should put somewhere around 10% of their operation back into research for their own good. I used to think that number was 2%. I believe it's probably 10% now. And the reason is because there's so many things to work with, right? And so what I would say is nitrogen management is an evolution, not a wholesale change. So you need to look at your system and you say, what's the next thing I can implement? And so if it's nitrogen stabilizers and you've never used nitrogen stabilizers, go ahead and use them, right? And see how that works out for you. And then maybe layer the next thing in, right? And the next thing in. And then as you're seeing success on that 10%, take it to the other 90% of your operation. And what you'll see over the years, right? Like, you start adopting things that work. And the beauty of that is what works for you might not work for your neighbor in some of these situations, right? And then really talk to an agronomist that has that same kind of hunger for knowledge and understanding to really dig into those things with you. And then, pull experts from the companies that you're looking at products for and ask them questions on exactly how the product works and what exactly somebody like me in my role should be able to tell you exactly. You shouldn't say exactly, with a fair amount of confidence when and where a product should perform and to what extent in given conditions it should perform to, right? Because I know a nitrogen stabilizer doesn't perform the same way on every acre in the United States from a yield standpoint. From a what it does to the sustainability piece and that nitrification, denitrification, and volatilization, it does that every time. But given other conditions, it may not contribute to yield the exact same way every year. So understanding like what conditions are perfect and what conditions are less than ideal. The problem is with nitrogen, we don't know what the conditions are 90% of the time, are going to be most of the time when we apply the nitrogen. We don't know what's going to happen after that. So what it does is it gives you this confidence of I'm using a product that works all the time from a functional standpoint, but its contribution to yield is going to change given from year to year because of different conditions.
Mike, it's always great to see you, and thank you for this interesting conversation getting into nitrogen management and the sustainable and sustainability elements as well. It's so interesting how all of those things interact and intertwine together.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, Megan. I really like nitrogen's probably it's my largest passion, right? Like it's where I spend most of my time thinking. So it's always a pleasure to get to share my thoughts with you and growers.
It's Mike Zwingman, a row crop agronomist head for Verdesian. Today for NUE Goals for NUE Ag, our focus was on nitrogen management. I'm Meghan Grebner for Brownfield.